Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder of the Schiller Institute and the initiator of the International Peace Coalition, which has a call every single week on Friday. Today is December 3rd, 2025. I'm Harley Schlanger. I will be your host, and you can email questions and comments to Helga. Send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat page, and we're happy to hear from you. Now, Helga, there have been a series of meetings between Russian and U.S. officials to work out the peace plan for Ukraine. Putin yesterday had a 5-hour-long meeting with Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. Details are scarce, but both sides expressed satisfaction with the discussion and the progress. However, leading officials of European governments were obviously unhappy and are in a lockstep mobilization to sabotage any agreement and continue the NATO war against Russia. So the first question is, as Putin said, Europe is pushing the continent toward war. Why?
Well, that is a very difficult question to answer because there is no rational argument. As a matter of fact, the whole world should be happy if at least one of the major geopolitical crisis spots come to a conclusion, very much at the cost of the Ukrainians. The country is pretty much destroyed. They don't have enough troops to refill the front lines. So it's an utter disaster, and people should be happy if this unnecessary dying would stop. And they should be thankful to both Trump and Putin that they're trying to find a solution, about which, by the way, advisor Ushakov said that progress has been made, but there's still a lot of work to do both in Washington and in Moscow. So it seems that they're making progress, but it's not yet, all the details have not been sorted out, which is not surprising given the nature of the problem. But, the Europeans keep pushing, and the whole world is not agreeing with them. The global majority do not share the narrative they are putting out. The so-called global West is isolated. They really represent a minority of the world population, and if they continue the way they are acting, they can only achieve either World War III, which, is a danger, or they could become completely isolated, marginalized, and being pushed aside. And fortunately, this is not all of Europe. It's just the so-called coalition of the willing. That is, the Germany, France, Great Britain, the Polish, the Baltic countries, and Scandinavia, and naturally von der Leyen and the EU Commission. And they, the recent statement by the head of the NATO military commission, an Italian vice admiral called Dragone, he said that maybe NATO has to become more aggressive, that, they should have even a preemptive attack on Russia. This is utter insanity. When Putin then says the Europeans are pushing the world to war, that is what is the result of such statements by this draconian Dragone, or whatever his name is. Or maybe he should be called Dracone. In any case, I think it is very, very clear that, in my view, the NATO should be resolved, because, if you are in a military alliance where you have an offensive policy which does not make sense, and you have, in the case of war, you have no chance to come out alive, it obviously does not make sense. And NATO, in my view, lost its raison d'etre in any case after the Warsaw Pact dissolved in 1991. So I think, we need a different conception, which is why I pushed since the beginning of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the idea that we need a new security and development architecture, which emphatically must take into account the interest of every single country on the planet. That is why the Peace of Westphalia worked. This is why Versailles did not work, because in the Versailles proceedings and the Paris Treaty of 1919, there were the Soviet Union, China, and Germany excluded, and therefore it was just the stepping stone to World War II. If we learned anything from history, we should really, basically understand that there can be only an inclusive security for everybody, or there is no security for nobody.
Here's a question from Denise from New Jersey. She asks, how are the youth in Europe responding to the calls of Merz, Macron, and Starmer for a war with Russia? Are they signing up to join the military?
Well, I think there are many signs that this is a big discussion issue among pupils and students, because they perfectly understand that they would be the cannon fodder in a meaningless war. So there is a poll which says that 80% of the youth in Germany do not want to be involved in the draft. And this coming Friday, that is 2 days from now, there is a national call by various youth organizations to have a strike against the idea of the draft. Now, I don't know what form it will take, if it will actually lead to pupils not going to school. Naturally, the official institutions are putting a lot of pressure and say that there is no right to not go to school. There is a duty to go to school. But the pupils could also very well meet in rallies and demonstrations in the afternoon on Friday. And it seems that in many German cities, such events are being organized. And that is a hopeful sign, because the young people of the world must speak out. And that has been recognized not only by the Schiller Institute, we are putting a lot of emphasis on the need to have a youth organization internationally, but also the Pope Leo XIV, just addressed, I think, 15,000 young people from Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, where he said, the young people have the enthusiasm to change history, and he called on them to do exactly that. And also President Putin, in a meeting with young scientists, emphasized, the absolute beauty of the spirit of young people fighting for creativity, and that is the most important driving factor in history. I'm now paraphrasing a little bit what he's saying, but there is obviously a recognition that some of the present elites or establishments, because they're not really elites, not in an intellectual sense for sure, that they are too vested, they have too many vested interests, that they think they have to stick to their narrative, and even if that narrative is completely failing, they fear that their entire career is somehow stuck to this. So you cannot expect them to change, but if the young people start to express their protest, then there is actually hope. So I'm quite interested what will happen this Friday. So if you want to send greetings to them, please do so, because I think they would be very happy to have international support.
Now, here's a question from a podcaster for you, who said some NATO military officials are calling for a preemptive strike against Russia. You mentioned this, the Admiral Draconian, the chair of NATO's military committee, but the head of the French military chief of staff criticized the people of France, saying they're not willing to sacrifice their children in war. And so the question from the podcaster is there anyone in France speaking out against this barbarism? Is this reflective of Macron's policy?
Yes, I heard that there was a wave of protest against this because, this Mandon, I think is his name, if I'm not mistaken, for him to say, what's wrong with the French is that they're not willing to sacrifice their children. This is barbarian. This is absolutely, I would even say it's coming close to a mental disorder, because who in their right mind would want to sacrifice their children? The guy should see a psychiatrist.
Well, on that same topic, you said that any sane European country should leave NATO. Is there any chance of this? Is there more flaking away from the NATO or the European Union?
Well, I think if NATO keeps they just had a meeting where apparently, there was such a push so that the Hungarian foreign minister Szijjártó basically completely distanced himself from that after this meeting, accusing them of pushing for war. So I can very well imagine that, if this is going any further, that, those countries who do not agree, that is for sure Hungary, Slovakia, with the new president, the Czech Republic, but also some countries in the in the Balkans, including, Spain, Iceland. I mean, these are all countries who are not part of the coalition of the willing. And I can imagine that, with Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, they just put through an unbelievable new, I don't know, executive statement or something, where they decided, the EU Commission and the so-called High Commissioner, which is a ridiculous name in the first place, that they want to have a war Schengen, a military Schengen. They made such a ruling on the 19th of November. And what it actually says is that in the future, war, you have to move troops and weapons very quickly from west to east, and naturally the wounded back from the east to the west. So there should be no limitation in the borders, and no country should have the right to oppose such a transport if it comes to a serious condition. Now, they call that military Schengen. That's completely outrageous. And I can only hope that the countries who do not want to sacrifice their existence step out and say, we are not part of this anymore.
Now, our webcast today has a title, "Will Going to War Save the European Economy?" There was a report issued in the last days by the German Federation of Industry, the BDI, which described the national economy in Germany in free fall. In presenting the report, the BDI president issued the following statement: "The economy is experiencing the most severe crisis since the founding of the Federal Republic, yet the federal government is not responding with sufficient resolve. German industry," he said, "is facing a dramatic low point at the end of 2025. We expect production to slump by 2% this year, marking the fourth consecutive year of decline in industrial production. This is not a cyclical dip," he said, "but a structural decline." So we got two questions on this. The first one is, why is this happening and what are the causes of this meltdown? The second one, how can the leaders of Europe call for militarization and push for war when the physical economy is collapsing?
Well, on the first question, it is happening. It's actually going on for quite some time because all these green policies by the EU Commission have undermined the compatibility and productivity of the German economy in particular, but also other European economies. So they already lost substance for several years. The Green Deal of von der Leyen, was a real death blow. And then came on top of that the sabotage of Nord Stream pipelines, which the German government, it's unbelievable to the present day, Chancellor Scholz completely went along with it. And there's a big discussion underneath the surface that he knew what Biden was saying when Biden said, yes, we have means to prevent the pipeline of ever functioning. And Scholz was standing there like a little boy, nodding and saying, we do everything together, And people are, we are losing everything what has been built in the post-war period out of the rubble field. The work of several generations is going out of the window as a result. So naturally, with the Nord Stream pipelines gone, the energy prices, I think it varies between 3 times to, in some cases, 5 times the price of what Americans have to pay for energy. And naturally, other countries also have lower energy prices. So a lot of the energy dependent industries are going abroad, investing elsewhere, in the United States, in China, in Switzerland, in other countries. So the entire substance of German industry is collapsing. There are bankruptcies. I don't have the figures here right now, but you have a long, long, long list of firms who are laying off workers and employees by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. So the whole structure of the German economy is just, the bottom is falling out. And I can only say, if there's not a reversal of that very quickly, it will have the most incredible social consequences. And it's naturally bringing down the entire European economy, because the European economies are extremely interconnected among each other. And therefore, if the strongest economy, the German one, is collapsing, it will have a massive downfall effect on all the other economies as well.
Do you think a statement like this from the BDI creates the potential for a mobilization of the Mittelstand, the small and medium enterprises in Germany? Is that going to take place?
I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, there was already a freak out about this statement, and people said, oh, he's exaggerating. The media naturally went after him. But I think it absolutely is, in my view, it's even an understatement of the year, because the collapse is so dramatic and so massive that you should have a national emergency, going for Glass-Steagall, going for the special investment programs which Merz immediately put on the table after he got into office, which they are now wasting for the military. And there are now studies also which say that the investments in the military is not an advantage to the physical economy, but a disadvantage, because it binds capital in areas which are completely not only unproductive, but are actually a destruction, because weapons, they only fill the pockets of the speculators, but not, it doesn't, you cannot eat them, you cannot live in them. It's just a complete waste of material and investment in energy.
Now, there are a couple of questions on the possibility of a war between the United States and Venezuela. From a peace activist in the United Kingdom, she writes, why is Trump so committed to ending the war in Ukraine while preparing for a war against Venezuela? Do you think this is primarily driven by oil politics, that is the threat to flood the world with Venezuelan oil after Maduro's gone to hurt the Russians, or a perceived economic threat from China moving into Central and South America? Which do you think is the driver for this?
Well, Chinese presence in Latin America should not be regarded as a threat. It's a benefit. Because, what is the problem of the migrant question? What is going on in the United States right now against so-called illegal migrants? Some of them are living and are integrated in the American economy since years, if not decades. So the ICE police is arresting these people with an unbelievable brutality. People are going to the lawyer trying to legalize their status, and then they're being ripped out of their car and being arrested and whatnot. It's ugly. And Trump has made some statements that he wants to kick out all immigrants from the global south. I mean, this is, first of all, not feasible, because all these people, many of them make work which the Americans don't want to do anymore, like, service economy, cleaning, work in the countryside, in the fields. So it will have an enormous economic effect. But more importantly, you are not going to solve that problem by having such, I would say, proto-fascist, if not fascist policies towards migrants. The only reasonable approach would be to cooperate with China to build up the economies of Latin America and have people stay home and contribute to the building up of their countries. Now, I think that behind that is the fact that I think President Trump is, surrounded by people who are obviously advising him. One of them is naturally Marco Rubio, who's famous for his, hatred against certain countries in Latin America. And it seems that they have the control over what comes out of President Trump's mouth. I have not heard of Tulsi Gabbard for a while. Others who look more reasonable have been quiet. So I don't know what the factional situation in the White House is. But, it's very clear the oil is a factor. There were some insane articles saying that, that if the United States captures all the oil in Venezuela, exports it, it will drive the oil price to a historic low. That will ruin Russia. That way you can get regime change in Russia. This is, shooting yourself in the foot, but doing a couple of knots in your body before you do it. It's like, it's completely crazy. But I think the real underlying issue is that there is among certain oligarchical people a geopolitical idea that the rise of China has to be prevented and reversed. It cannot be prevented. It can only be reversed by war. You have a flare-up of the crisis with Taiwan with Japan. I think that's all part of the same idea that, the new system which is emerging has to be stopped. And it cannot be stopped. How can you think you can stop 85% of the world population, which is organizing itself to, create a more just economic system? So I think it's primarily geopolitics, which is why I keep raising this issue that we have to overcome geopolitics, because I think that's the biggest disease we could all kill ourselves with if we don't overcome it.
Now, there's another question on Trump and the whole situation in South America. There's a report that Trump had a productive discussion with Brazil's President Lula, and he spoke in that discussion favorably about building a partnership to combat drug trafficking. And the question came in, do you know if anyone around Trump or Trump himself is familiar with the LaRouche book, Dope Incorporated, which identifies the city of London and not fishermen in Venezuela as the source of the international drug trade?
Well, I don't know, but maybe that would be a good idea if many people want to send a Christmas present to the White House. You could all buy the Dope Incorporated book and send it, send it to Melania, send it to, Trump himself. Flood the White House with Dope Incorporated. That may get through.
Good idea. I have a question for you on German politics. I don't think you can escape German politics, Helga. The questioner says, do you expect action to be taken against the Alternative for Deutschland by the German security services, such as banning them from participating in elections? And they go on to say, is it possible that the two leading anti-war parties, the AfD and the BSV, could join together to fight against anti-German policies coming from London and NATO?
Well, as far as I know, there are actually discussions among these two parties because, obviously BSV, which fell short only of a few thousand, very few thousand votes, and there were many irregularities, so they demanded a recount of the vote, which was just dismissed by a court, so they will probably not get it. Against the AfD are also similar moves by, some people really want to outlaw them. For example, the Greens, I think in Sachsen-Anhalt, who have 3%, they are making a motion to outlaw the AfD, which has somewhere I don't know where they are in Sachsen-Anhalt, but they have around 30 or probably much more percent. So it's ridiculous, that shows you democracy. In any case, this whole thing really illustrates how misused the word democracy has become. For example, the AfD had the founding of their youth movement just this past weekend. And, there were, according to the organizers of the demonstration, 50,000 people demonstrating against it. They blocked all the roads. Some people were hanging from the bridges, in order to block the road. So the whole event could only start several hours later because the delegates could not get in the room. There were, I think, 4,000 policemen injured. I don't know, that sounds a little bit lot. But in any case, there were many, many policemen injured. And, they had to use, sticks and tear gas and water cannons. So it was really violent. So then you ask yourself the question, who are the right-wing extremists? Is it not those who are using violence to block the formation of a party? Now, I may not agree with everything the AfD is saying, but, I think the idea of a firewall, not talking to them, is just as undemocratic because they represent by now, I think in the polls, they're the strongest party of Germany. In some of the eastern countries, eastern states, they're even in the government. And I think it's the question mark of who is undemocratic, the answer is more on the camp of those who are trying to prohibit the AfD than the other way around.
I have one final question for you. And by the way, you're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche. If you did not get a question in today, we'll be back next week. But this is a question on one of the crazy things going on in Southwest Asia. When President Trump was in Israel, he asked the president of Israel, Herzog, to pardon Netanyahu, who's facing trial, is actually in trial on bribery and corruption charges. President Trump asked him to be pardoned. And usually you get pardoned after a guilty plea or a guilty verdict. Herzog said he's going to do what's best for Israel. And one of my correspondents said, perhaps if Netanyahu wants to get out of the trial, he should say that he's not guilty by reason of insanity. What do you think about this case? Why is it that Trump would stick his neck out to save Bibi Netanyahu?
Well, that is a question which I think has a lot to do with the financial supporters of Trump inside the United States. I think Netanyahu, in the meantime, asked Herzog for a pardon himself, which obviously means an admission of guilt. I think this is just a completely, unbelievable situation. And I think the governments who are still supporting what the Israeli government is doing make themselves co-guilty. Because despite the so-called peace agreement and ceasefire, the killing is going on, maybe a little bit reduced, but not very much. There are still arbitrary shootings in Gaza. There are even videos circulating made by the IDF soldiers themselves, full of glee when they're shooting innocent and unarmed Palestinians. So I think this is continuing the big wound in the conscience of the world, and I can only hope that our efforts to put the Oasis plan on the table in the context of a new security and development architecture will be effective soon, because otherwise I think there is no hope in sight unless you change the entire international order.
Well, it's clear, Helga, as we're heading toward Christmas and the end of the year, none of these crises have abated. They should be on everybody's mind. And with that said, we have the International Peace Coalition weekly call coming up on Friday. What do you expect to be the topics taken up this week? I mean, obviously, war and peace.
Yeah, I think the Ukraine situation, because that is clearly coming to an end. I mean, it's simply going to end either by, complete lost attrition, uh, the war of attrition being lost on the side of the Ukrainians, uh, any effort by the coalition of the willing to prolong it will just mean that the Russians will come. They're already convinced that it has to be solved militarily, and hopefully, if between Trump and Putin there is progress, and that hopefully the United States asserts itself against this effort by some Europeans to continue the war, that it does come to an early end. So that will be for sure a topic. It may also be that we will discuss the recent crisis between China and Japan, which is, Takaichi, the prime minister, made some unbelievable remarks three weeks ago, saying that if China is intervening militarily in Taiwan, that is an existential threat to Japan, and that Japan would militarily intervene. That has caused an enormous sharp reaction, not only on the side of China, also Russia and many other countries in the region. So and it's being cooked, every day. The media and think tank, Chatham House, and everybody is, trying to stir the conflict further. And it's very clear that if the Ukraine war comes to an end, there are some people who like to open another front, like in Venezuela and around Taiwan. So I think the topic for sure will be both these individual crises, but also to try to get people a sense of how they all hang together, because that is why I keep saying that you cannot look at these crises individually alone, but you have to think about the underlying axioms and correct those mistakes in the thinking if you want to avoid a catastrophe. So absolutely get on board, because we have to do everything to unify the peace movement internationally, which is still very far from being unified. And that's why, despite the fact that the majority of people are for peace, their voice is not being heard adequately, because the peace movement still allows itself to be divided.
And for those of you who didn't get this earlier, it's 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday. You can get the link from the schillerinstitute.com. And with that, Helga, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you later, hopefully Friday.
Yes, till Friday.